Let me share with you a truly wild and heart-wrenching story about my toxic parents, the very people who not only booted me out when I turned 18 and completely cut me off, but later had the nerve to show up uninvited at my son's birthday party, begging for money, and then even attempted to drag me into court over a $50,000 sum that I never stole. Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. If you enjoy this story and find it as riveting as I do, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and share for your support. I'm a 28-year-old man who, just 3 days ago, celebrated my son's third birthday in a modest yet memorable way. The party was mainly attended by our coworkers, many of whom have children of their own, and a handful of my son's friends from daycare, along with their parents. I had planned for a cheerful, uncomplicated celebration, expecting an afternoon filled with laughter and innocent fun. However, little did I know that this day of celebration would soon be marred by a painful blast from my past. In an unexpected twist, I had also invited my estranged parents to join us. They had reached out to me 2 weeks earlier, asking if they could meet and try to make amends. Their sudden attempt to reconnect stirred up a whirlwind of conflicting emotions within it might have been legally questionable. In any case, they seized the first opportunity they had, and while I wasn't entirely shocked by the inevitability of it, I was nonetheless stunned that they chose to do it on such an important day, and just when I was on the cusp of starting a new chapter in college. In the aftermath, I pleaded with them, begging them to allow me to remain in the house at least until I graduated, and to help cover my tuition. I hoped that maybe, just maybe, they would soften their stance. Instead, they remained adamant. They wanted me completely out of their lives so that they could pursue their own plans without the hindrance of my presence. Their grand scheme involved starting a new business venture, a high-risk financial endeavor, and then hitting the open road in an RV to travel the States. Although I couldn't fault them for dreaming big, I was determined not to let their ambitions come at the expense of my future. I tried every manipulation tactic I could muster, pleading, reasoning, and even resorting to full-blown sobbing, in a desperate bid to change their minds. None of it worked. Instead, they coldly informed me that I had 1 month to pack up and leave, with the expectation that I would immediately find a way to support myself financially. Their decision was final and left me with no choice but to embark on a lonely journey toward independence. At that time, I was working as a cashier at a local mall store, diligently saving money with the dream of one day buying my own car. However, after that fateful conversation with my parents, I decided to leave and put every saved penny to use in building a life without them. I wasn't rich by any means, but the deep, searing hurt and anger I felt compelled me to make a clean break. In the 2 days that followed, I reached out via text to every relative I could think of, hoping for a helping hand or a place to stay. Unfortunately, most of them turned their backs on me, a painful confirmation of why I had never spoken out against my parents before. I had never truly had anyone reliable to count on. Even my friends, though kind at heart, were absorbed in their own lives and couldn't offer a permanent refuge. In the midst of that isolation, a ray of hope appeared in the form of a distant relative, one of my mother's cousins, Uncle Kevin. He answered my desperate emails with genuine compassion, offering me a place to live on the condition that I make myself useful around the house. Desperate for a safe haven, I didn't hesitate. I packed my bags and journeyed to Utah to live with Uncle Kevin. I didn't inform my parents, nor did they even ask. I left without so much as a final goodbye, and I suspect they simply didn't care. Uncle Kevin turned out to be an absolute gem, even though he did expect me to help out with various chores around the house. He also ran a small, popular diner that was well loved by locals, and he offered me a job as a cashier there. He promised that if I worked hard and showed sincerity in my efforts, he would pay for my college tuition. Though a bit eccentric, Uncle Kevin was financially secure thanks to a generous inheritance from his grandparents, and with no immediate family of his own, he was more than willing to invest in my future. By working diligently at his diner, I managed to pay for college. After graduating and moving out on my own, I offered to start repaying him, but he kindly refused, saying he'd collect his dues once I achieved greater success. Tragically, a few years later, Uncle Kevin passed away suddenly from a stroke, even before his housekeeper could get him to the hospital in time. I remain forever grateful for his support, and I will always cherish the fact that he was there for me at my wedding, effectively filling the void left by my absent biological parents. Throughout those years, Uncle Kevin never had a particularly good relationship with his own family, including my mother, both in his youth and as an adult. This meant that my parents never learned where I had spent those crucial years, nor did they discover who had paid for my tuition. And if they did find out, they simply chose not to contact me. I hadn't heard from my parents at all until a few weeks ago, when they unexpectedly reached out via social media. A cousin had helped them track me down, and upon learning that I was now married and had a 3-year-old son, they sent a message apologizing for all the wrongs they had done over the years and expressing a desire to make things right, largely because they wanted to meet my wife and son. Initially, I found their apology to be half-hearted and insincere, and I nearly ignored their message. But within a day, they sent another message insisting that they desperately wanted to meet their grandson before it was too late, a clear attempt to emotionally manipulate me. Despite my misgivings and all the hurt they had caused, I reluctantly agreed and told them they could come over on the day of my son's birthday. When I discussed this with my wife, she admitted that she was perfectly fine with having them over, as long as I was comfortable with the decision. We have been married for 5 years, and she was well aware of our tumultuous history. For her, the idea of family was very important, having lost her own parents at a very young age and being raised by her grandparents, who, sadly, passed away in recent years. She longed for a sense of family connection. It was clear that she yearned for some semblance of the familial love she had always missed, and she hoped that my estranged parents might fill that void. Even though I wasn't interested in reconciliation, I sensed that my wife's heart was set on the idea of family unity, and I didn't want to stand in the way of her desires. So, for her sake, I invited my parents to the party. On the day itself, they arrived a full hour before the other guests, seeking some private, one-on-one time with me. The encounter was laden with awkward silences and discomfort, yet we managed to exchange a few polite words. I introduced them to my wife and son, and for the most part, they behaved with a veneer of courtesy and respect. Shortly thereafter, when my wife went into the kitchen to prepare some tea for my father, my mother pulled me aside. In a hushed tone, away from my wife's ears, she confided that there was something else she needed to discuss. In that quiet moment, my parents offered another apology, admitting that they had finally come to their senses after years of neglect and mistreatment during my childhood. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were sincere. But before I could fully accept their apology, they casually revealed that they were in desperate need of money. They explained that their extravagant travels had rapidly drained their savings, leaving them struggling to keep up with mounting bills, and that they were now relying on the fact that my wife and I were financially stable, she being a real estate agent and I working at a bank, to bail them out. I was absolutely incensed by their confession. Their sudden financial plea completely undermined the sentiment of their apology, reducing it to a sham excuse to guilt me into giving them money. They even tried to use the presence of their grandson as an emotional lever to soften my resolve. While I remained stoic and unmoved by their manipulative tactics, my wife, who deeply missed having a complete family, seemed more receptive to their emotional appeal. In that moment, I deeply regretted ever having invited them over. After that tense conversation, I chose to say nothing further. My wife, having returned from the kitchen with tea for my dad and coffee for everyone else, appeared content and cheerful, which made it even harder for me to broach the subject further. My mother softly urged me to reconsider, and when my wife asked what we had been discussing, I promised that we would talk about it later, just not while the guests were still arriving. For the next few minutes, my wife engaged in easy-flowing conversation with my parents, clearly enjoying their company, while I sat silently, waiting for an opportunity to let the tension dissipate. Just as the first of our guests arrived, I saw an opportunity to distract myself from the charged atmosphere. I threw myself into managing the party details and playing with my son, and soon enough, it was time for the cake cutting, a moment that went off without a hitch, with everyone enjoying themselves. However, just as I was about to step into the kitchen with my wife, my parents intercepted me once again, inquiring if I had reached a decision about our earlier conversation. That was the last straw. I snapped at them, telling them they could wait in the living room with the other guests while I made my decision after everyone had received their slice. Seizing the moment, I took my place in the middle of the living room and began delivering a speech that I had been rehearsing in my head since their repeated interruptions earlier that day. I formally introduced my parents to all the guests, many of whom had never met them before, and at first, their faces lit up with a brief expression of relief at being acknowledged. But as I moved into the more painful part of my narrative, the smiles slowly faded. I recounted the story of my childhood, explaining how they had heartlessly kicked me out, and how I had been taken in by my compassionate Uncle Kevin. I wrapped the painful details in humor and light-hearted jokes, transforming my deep-seated sorrow into a kind of stand-up routine. While the guests chuckled politely, my parents appeared visibly humiliated, and my wife maintained a stoic, unreadable expression throughout the entire speech. I made sure to mention that my parents and I had not spoken for a full 10 years after their callous abandonment, and I recalled how they had only recently contacted me to meet their grandson, a gesture I nearly blocked, had it not been for a faint gratitude that at least they weren't purely after my money. I managed to pass off my bitter recollections as a series of humorous anecdotes, and soon I returned to my seat among the guests while my parents exchanged uneasy chuckles, their humiliation evident even as they attempted to mask it with forced laughter. As the night wore on, the guests gradually began to leave, and my parents were the first to depart in a hasty exit. When they reached the door, they shot me the nastiest, most disdainful glares imaginable without uttering a single word, a silent dismissal that, in a way, I was grateful for, as I had no desire for a confrontation right on my doorstep. Later that night, after we put our son to bed, I finally had a quiet moment to speak with my wife and tried to explain everything. But before I could utter a word, she exploded in anger. She accused me of making an unnecessary and stupid speech and demanded that I apologize to all the guests for making them uncomfortable, as well as to my parents for humiliating them without any valid reason. I attempted to explain that my parents had only come over to beg for money. That was the sole reason behind their visit, but she brushed aside my explanation, insisting that I had ruined our son's birthday by turning the celebration into a platform for my own grievances. I thought her reaction was wildly unfair, especially since our son is just 3 years old and will likely forget all of this in a matter of weeks or years. Meanwhile, the guests seemed to take my story in stride, even finding humor in the way I recounted it, given the context of a birthday party. I felt compelled to let my parents know exactly how deeply disappointed I was in them as human beings, yet my wife was adamant that I needed to apologize to everyone present for my bad behavior. That day, I was already under immense stress, between the emotional manipulation of my parents and the escalating conflict with my wife, who seemed to dismiss my feelings entirely. In a moment of raw frustration, I lashed out at her, insisting that I had invited my parents because she wanted me to, and that if anyone should be more understanding, it was her. In return, she accused me of being self-involved and hypocritical. Before long, she burst into tears, and although I immediately tried to comfort her, she rejected my efforts, declaring that I owed an apology to every single guest at the party. In a final act of defiance, she moved all her personal belongings to the guest bedroom and has been sleeping there ever since. Since that night, we haven't spoken a word, primarily because I still haven't apologized to the guests. I stand by what I did. I don't believe my speech was out of line at all. If anything, I feel that my wife is overreacting to what happened. I haven't heard a single complaint from the guests or even from my parents about my speech, which leads me to believe that perhaps she has built up the situation in her head, imagining that others will harshly judge us. I've tried to explain that I had already made significant concessions by ignoring my parents before the party to keep the peace, but their persistent pressure was simply too much. In all honesty, I even admitted that my wife had a stronger desire to see them at the party than I did, a fact she didn't deny during our argument that night. Even though my wife insists that I ruined the party, I feel that I did nothing wrong. I tried to handle the situation as gracefully as possible, only allowing my emotions to show when my parents took things too far by continuously asking for money. Given that they kicked me out at 18 and abandoned me for 10 long years, I believe it was entirely fair to publicly shame them at my son's birthday party. I am willing to apologize to my wife for calling her self-involved. That comment was definitely out of line, but I cannot, in good conscience, apologize to my parents for exposing their true, manipulative nature in front of everyone. A few days later, I sat down with my wife to discuss everything that had transpired. The comment section on my original online post was wildly divided over whether I should have acted differently, but I decided that the most important thing was to have an honest conversation with my wife. After all, that's what marriage is all about. It had been 6 long days since the party, during which we barely spoke and even ended up sleeping in separate rooms, all in an effort to shield our little 3-year-old son from the fallout. That morning, before we left for work, I insisted that we needed to talk. Thankfully, she didn't ignore me, and with our son quietly having breakfast in another room, we finally sat down to speak privately. I apologized for calling her self-involved, admitting that it was a hurtful remark, but I also maintained that I did not ruin the party. I explained that my speech was never meant to steal the spotlight but was rather a necessary call-out of my parents' repeated manipulations. I gently suggested that maybe she had overreacted a bit, and after a heartfelt discussion, she admitted that in her anger, she had acted selfishly and had not fully considered my feelings. She even confessed that she had been the one subtly pushing me to invite my parents, despite not saying it outright, because she longed for the family completeness she never experienced as a child. We both apologized for our lack of communication, and we agreed that it might be wise to pursue couples counseling in addition to our individual therapy sessions, in order to work through our issues. Almost immediately after that, I posted another update online. To my utter surprise, my parents responded by sending a lawsuit, alleging that I had stolen $50,000 from them before I ran away 10 years ago. Now that they had finally managed to track me down, they were demanding that I return the money, a claim that is completely baseless. I can only pity the attorney involved, as it seems he must be in dire financial straits to take on such a ludicrous case. Needless to say, I have no intention of entertaining any of their nonsense. I've already contacted my lawyer. In an ironic twist, my wife retracted all of her earlier statements about me needing to apologize to my parents, as she now sees exactly what kind of people they truly are. They may believe that their manipulative ways will allow them to get away with everything, even though I was relatively polite when they first appeared on my son's birthday. Now, with no reservations about the consequences, I'm posting everything online to ensure that everyone is aware not only of their current antics, but also of the long history of mistreatment they've inflicted on me. Shortly thereafter, I decided to post every single detail of my story on my Facebook profile. Within just 20 minutes, I braced myself for the inevitable backlash. Although I haven't received any texts or calls directly yet, I know that many people are going to be mad, especially since I mentioned how none of my family ever took me in when I needed them most. It's almost laughable how those same relatives, who once shunned me, are now suddenly trying to be friendly now that my circumstances have improved. For clarity's sake, I have never invited anyone to any events, just to be clear, but it seems that those who once turned their backs on me are now eager to be associated with me, likely because they see an opportunity for their own gain. With a well-connected relative and a bank, it seems like everything is coming full circle, and I'm waiting patiently to see what happens next. After nearly 3 days of relative silence, I'm back with one final update. My parents went absolutely ballistic after my online post, calling me repeatedly and demanding that I take the post down. I only relented after they texted me a promise, in writing, that they would withdraw their lawsuit. Once I had that in writing, they blocked me. What truly shocked me, however, was the reaction of my relatives. Those whose names I mentioned in the post became so triggered that they left scathing, nasty comments about me, my wife, and even my son. This behavior only confirmed what I've long suspected about them. They are terribly selfish and idiotic. Ironically, it was their own children who showed a modicum of decency by apologizing for their parents' actions, a small consolation amid all the chaos. I have since taken down that post, but so many people saw it already. In a poetic twist of karma, every single person who once turned their back on me has now received their just desserts. My parents have withdrawn their lawsuit, and I've reconnected with the relatives who once abandoned me. My wife and I are still standing strong, and as I sign off now, I want to thank everyone who has followed my story here on Reddit. I think it's time for me to take a break. Signing off, thank you for reading, and take care.